ladies. It is Christy Love, founder and executive director of LeadHer, and we are back with another edition of our LeadHer local teachings for 2014 with LeadHer Bootcamp. This is March, and we're in our third session of Bootcamp. And so if you're just joining us, let me kind of catch you up just a little bit on what we've done so far. We started out the year in January talking about our purpose. We did some assessments trying to figure out what is your purpose and what is your calling in life. We talked about how everybody has a purpose, that you were made with a specific purpose in mind. And that purpose combines your talents and your passions and your spiritual gifts. And it really carves out this special place just for you in the universe, where God wants to do something uniquely in you and uniquely through you. From there, we started to talk about how a lot of times that purpose is existing outside of our comfort zone. It pushes us outside of our comfort zone in order to fulfill that purpose. So last month in February, that's what we talked about. In fact, we used this balance beam that I'm sitting on today kind of as this analogy for our comfort zones and our callings, and how so many times we want to sit right here and be comfortable on the edge of that calling. But God calls us not just to sit on our callings, but He calls us to walk and operate in that calling. Well, this month, ladies, I am so excited because I really feel like this is probably the most important teaching that we are going to do all year. We're going to talk about facing your fears, because here's what I know to be true. What we've talked about so far, that you have a purpose, you have a calling, and I know that calling often pushes us out of our comfort zone. The problem is we can't go any further this year in boot camp, getting in shape to serve Him, until we conquer the things that keep us from actually leaving and actually walking in what we need to be doing. I'm going to venture to guess, if I ask most of you, how many of you still are struggling to step out of your comfort zone? You're still wrestling with that a little bit. I'm going to guess, if I asked you to raise your hands right now in your LeadHer local chapter meeting, that probably 80 to 90% of you are going to raise your hands and say, yes, I'm still struggling. I'm still clinging with those white knuckles to the edge of my comfort zone. I'm just not quite ready to tiptoe across that line yet, because I'm just not sure what's going to happen when I do. You know, I'm a big believer in this. What forms an invisible barrier that keeps a lot of us inside of our comfort zones is fear. And those fears, they hold us back. They keep us there because we're so afraid to cross over the boundaries into them, because it's this land of the unknown. We have this fear of the unknown. We're not sure what's going to happen when we do, when we let go of the edge of that comfort zone and we walk forward. So I want to talk to you today about this. First of all, what is fear? For those of you that have been around LeadHer a long time, you know that a lot of times I like to teach using acrostics or acronyms. I like to tell you kind of what does that word mean if we look at it a little bit at a time. And so for this month, I decided to do one again for fear. F-E-A-R. And this is what it stands for: forming excuses, accepting restraint. Now think about that just a second. A lot of times when we have a fear, we use that fear to justify our ability to form excuses. And we talked about that a little bit last month when we talked about sitting on our calling instead of walking in our calling. We talked about how a lot of times we'll sit here and we'll give God a list of all the buts. Well, a lot of times those buts are rooted in fear. We're saying, I'm afraid of what's going to happen. I'm afraid of failing. I'm afraid of, lack of security. I'm afraid of all these different things. We use those fears to form excuses that form that invisible barrier that hold us inside of our comfort zone. And when we do that, we accept restraint on ourselves. We're restraining ourselves from being all that God called us to be. Think about that for just a second, because when I thought about that in this context, accepting restraint, my fears are really me accepting restraint of God working through me. I'm restraining God's ability to work through me completely, because I'm giving into some of those fears. That was incredibly convicting to me. So I hope that you can really focus on that concept of accepting restraint and forming excuses as we talk about this. Because a few days ago on my Facebook page, I asked a question. I said, what is one of the biggest fears that you feel like you have in your life that holds you back from being the woman that God has called you to be? And I had a lot of people that responded, and I loved reading those. And I loved the honesty with which so many of those women shared those fears. And I also loved that I heard a lot of ditto, me too, I can relate to that. And we had that going back and forth because a lot of us share very similar fears. In fact, here's what I started to notice. While there were a lot of things named in that list, really, all of those fears could be boiled down to 5 major fears. You ready? The first one is fear of failure. I think that all of us struggle with that. We struggle with, what if we don't do it well enough? What if we fail? What if we don't get things right the first time? We struggle with fear of failure. The second one is this, fear of that lack of security. You know, statistics have shown that women really value our security. We want to know that things are going to get taken care of, that there's going to be food on the table, a roof over our heads, lights in the house. And that's something that's just very, very important to us, especially in relationships and different things like that. So if God's calling you to do something, He's revealing to you a purpose that might shake that sense of security, that can be incredibly fearful for a lot of us. The third one is fear of rejection. We're afraid of what happens if people don't like us. What if they don't agree with what we're doing? What if they reject our efforts to step out of our comfort zone? The fourth one is fear of the lack of control. This one hits home with me because I think a lot of times, and this can look like a lot of things, this can look like health control, this can look like control over our children, control over our finances, control over our relationships. When we have to let go of something, we have to empty our hands of one thing so that God can put something else in our hands, that's a fearful moment where we're having to let go of control. And for a lot of us, that's really, really scary. And then the final one is judgment, fear of judgment. This can go to all kinds of things, fear of public speaking, all of those different kinds of things that put us in front of people. We are so afraid of what other people are going to think of us that so many times we value more the opinions of others, the thoughts of others, the judgments of others on our actions than sometimes we even do with the way that God views us. And for a lot of you, you might be going, oh, I don't know about that, but think about that for just a second. A lot of times in our day is spent thinking, worrying, fearing, what is it that other people think about me? How are they judging me? How do they perceive me? Do they think that I'm good enough? Do they think that I'm measuring up? And we focus those thoughts and those fears on everyone around us. But if we would stop for just a minute and go, you know what? How does God see me? How does He see me measuring up? How does He judge me? That's really the only voice that matters in this. So we're going to dig into this today. We're going to talk about these 5 big fears, and just about any fear that I think you have or can come up with really kind of falls under these 5 big broad categories, and how these 5 big broad categories really have taught us as women how to form excuses and accept restraint, and they have held us back in fear for so long. We're going to talk today about how to face those, how to confront them, and how to overcome them. All right, ladies, so we're going to talk about fears. And I want to share with you a pretty radical concept, okay? When God started unpackaging this for me, it kind of took me a little while to wrap my head around this. But once I did, like I said earlier, that conviction that kind of came with that same realization about accepting restraint over myself, it was incredibly humbling. And I really hope that this has the same impact on you. Because one of the things that I'm coming to realize about fear is this. Fear is an idol. And let me explain to you what I mean. An idol really is defined as anything that stands between our heart and God's heart. And if we are entertaining fears in our life, and those fears are filling our hearts and they are filling our minds, we can't serve 2 masters. The gospel tells us that, and I know that when Jesus is doing that teaching, He's actually talking about money. He's talking about how we can't serve both God and money. But I want you to think about that same concept for a second between the concepts of faith and fear. Can we really serve both faith and fear at the same time? And the answer is no. Because if we're giving into our fears, if we're letting our fears control us, if we're letting our fears dictate our minds, if we're letting our fears of failure, lack of security, rejection, lack of control, or other people's judgment be the thing that we are most focused on every single day, and those things, if we allow those to be our compass and our determining factor for our actions, the motivation behind which we do things, we have a big problem. Because if that is the way that we are choosing to live our life and dictate our actions, then we're pushing out faith. Because we can't have both. We can't be ruled by both. So think about this concept with me for just a second. If we can't serve 2 masters, okay, this isn't you sacrifice to one or the other. This is you sacrifice one for the other. I either have to sacrifice my faith in order to focus and entertain and feed my fears, or I'm going to have to learn how to sacrifice my fears to be able to grow in my faith. That's a powerful moment. Take just a second to kind of let that register in your mind and your heart, because that's almost painful. It's almost painful for us, because there is not a woman that is at one of these meetings right now who I know can say, I don't struggle with any fears. I don't know what you're talking about. I don't have any fears at all. We all have fears. And part of that is simply because we're human. Human nature is inclined to be fearful because human nature desires control. We desire to know everything. We want to know how the end of the story is going to come. We want to know how so many of the situations that we're facing today are going to be resolved. And because we don't know, there's this huge fear of the unknown because there's a lack of control. We all have fear. This, ladies, is fundamental and foundational. For you to wrestle with this today, wherever you are at in your LeadHer local chapter, for you to wrestle with this and learn how to win this wrestling match is what's going to determine how you move forward from here the rest of the year. You can't graduate from this section of boot camp. This whole first quarter has really been on what is your calling? Where's the boundaries of your comfort zone? And what's restraining you within there? And how do we get past it so that we can move on and we can do the things that we are called to do? Because this is all about recognizing what we've been called to do and getting ready to go towards it. The rest of this year is really where we get in shape to serve. It's where we put that stuff into action, where we're actually serving within some of those callings. But you can't get to those places if you are going to be restrained by fear. If you are going to let the idol of fear be the focus that you choose to fixate your mind and your heart on. That is my deepest desire for you guys as you go through this teaching video this month, is that you will allow God to reveal to you what you are allowing to restrain you, what you are allowing yourself to become fixated on more than the sound of his voice, the call that he's putting on you. There's something for all of us in that. Think about it this way. When you are focusing on fear, you are focusing on your own road, your own path, what you want that to look like, your to-do list, because you can control that. You are focusing on your rules, the way that you want things to be done, the way that you want things to be done, the timing that you want things to be done, your way. That's what we do when we operate out of fear. We try to get control. We try to get control because if we have control, then we're not going to fail because we're not going to try things that might require us to fail. We're not going to have lack of security because we're going to stay right where it's secure and it's comfortable. We're not going to have rejection because we don't want to step out. We're not going to have judgment because if we just fade into the background and fly under the radar, then people can't judge us. Fear is all about control. It's us. It's me, myself, and I. You've heard me say this before. This is all about which Trinity are you focused on? Me, myself, and I, or God, the Father, and the Holy Spirit? Because let's shift focus. Okay, we can't serve two masters. This is what fear looks like. Fear looks like your way, your timing, your rules. Faith is God's path. It might not be the path that is the most comfortable. It might not be the path that is the easiest. It might be a path that is straight up the side of a hill, but it's the one that he's calling you to. And it's got to be done his way, in his timing, and that's all about relinquishing control. That's all about not being afraid to fail because you have faith that he's going to catch you. It's all about not being afraid to step out of your security because you have faith in his ability to secure you and provide for you. It's all about not being afraid of rejection because the Bible tells us God will not reject us. He loves us. This world might reject us, but he will never reject us. And there is a reward for us waiting in heaven when we are willing to let the world reject us for the sake of the gospel, for the sake of Christ, for the sake of choosing his path over that path that's dictated and paved in fear. Choosing his path says, you know what? I'm going to let go. I'm going to let go of control. And I don't care who judges me for that because I know and I have faith that the only judgment that matters is God's. There's a huge difference between the two, ladies. Take a second and ask yourself, which way are you living your life right now? Because we can't live it both ways. You can't decide to be sold out to faith if you're still going to dabble and take detours on that path of fear. You know, when we talk about idols, I think a lot of times that word just has such a strong connotation for so many of us because we think about idols as something that's being worshipped or, paid homage to. But think about this for just a second, Okay? The definition of worship is really this: to honor with your actions, your feelings, and your thoughts. I mean, that's what we do when we honor and we worship God, right? We're focusing our thoughts, our hearts on Him. We focus our actions on Him. We focus our feelings towards Him during that time of worship. How many times a day, and answer this just honestly for a second, how, in comparison, how much time a day do you spend worshiping God versus worshiping your fears? It's not an easy question for a lot of us to answer, because sadly for most of us, the answer is we spend a lot more time with our thoughts fixed and honored. Our thoughts, our actions, and our feelings are fixated more during the day a lot of times on those fears than they are on our faith. We have got to stop worshiping our fears. We have got to start worshiping a God that is bigger than any fear you could have today, no matter what it is. There is nothing too big for our God. There is no fear too great for Him to overcome. And the beautiful thing about our God is there is no fear that you face alone. Not one. He promises His continued presence. He promises that He will walk with us consistently all the time. I think back to the book of Joshua, and I think how many times did He repeat for Joshua, "Do not be afraid or discouraged, for the Lord your God is with you." And you might need to just hear me say that to you tonight as that reminder. Whatever fear you are facing, whatever fear that you have been worshiping and idolizing in your life, and I know that you didn't intend to worship or idolize it. None of us do. But that aha moment that goes, oh, I've never thought of it that way. Allow me just to say to you, do not be afraid or discouraged, for the Lord your God is with you in whatever you face, in wherever you go. And you can make a decision tonight to face these fears and go a different direction. We're going to talk about that. Okay, so a lot of you that have been around LeadHer for quite some time, you know I'm a very visual person. A lot of times when I'm dealing with a concept or wrestling with a teaching concept, I need to come up with something visual to help me understand it, but I also like to come up with visual things to help you understand it a little bit better. So here's kind of this visual concept that God gave me, and it goes right along with that acrostic: forming excuses and accepting restraint. I want you to see exactly what this looks like in our life. Exactly what happens when we start to give in and worship that idol of fear and allow that to become our focus. Okay, when we do that, I want you to picture this. A lot of times what ends up happening, and you'll see I've written those fears on these pieces of fabric, okay? But a lot of times they start to kind of group together. So I'm afraid of failure, okay? I'm afraid of lack of security. That lack of security, if I give that up, then I might fail. You know, I might lose my home. I might do this. I might do that. I might lose my job. But what ends up happening is I become so focused on these fears that I start to let them restrain me. So imagine for just a second, we're going to tie these right here on my feet. Okay? And this is going to completely bind me from being able to step forward. I can't go anywhere right now. I'm stuck because these fears have completely immobilized and paralyzed me. You know, we've got fear of rejection, fear of judgment, lack of control. A lot of times, ladies, when we choose to focus on these things and we choose to just let them dictate our thoughts and our feelings and our hearts, they just start to bind up our hands just like our feet. And before I know it, I am completely bound up. I'm completely restrained. And this is what we do. This is what fear looks like to you and to me. When we get in the habit of forming excuses on a consistent basis in our minds and in our hearts and justifying those fears because we form those excuses, then what we're really doing is we are accepting this position right here. We are accepting restraint in our life. And we're saying, you know what? God's got this big purpose for me. He's got this big call for me. I know He wants me to leave my comfort zone, but I can't, but I won't. And we form those excuses and we just accept it. We sit here on the edge of our calling and we don't go anywhere. We're completely restrained and we are rendered useless in this position right here. And you know what? This is one of the enemy's favorite positions to keep women in, because we're so naturally inclined to allow ourselves to become controlled by fear. As emotional creatures, as women, fears are they're natural for us. I'm not telling you that you're never going to feel no fear ever again. That's not what I'm saying to you. What I'm saying to you is you have to make a choice, ladies. You have to make a choice whether you are going to focus on your fears and allow them to dictate you and restrain you, bind your feet, bind your hands. We're called to be the hands and feet of Jesus. We're called to be the hands and feet of Jesus in our churches, in our communities, in our businesses, in our families, in our relationships. This is not what the hands and feet of Jesus are supposed to look like. They are not supposed to be tied up and restrained and kept from being effective. But this is what happens when we focus on our fears, when we worship our fears by honoring them with our thoughts and our actions and our feelings. We have got to stop worshiping those idols. And here's how we do it. 3 simple steps. They're simple to give you. I know that they're not simple to definitely apply. But the first one is this: you have to change your focus. You have to make a choice to change your focus. When you start to feel those fears rise up, when you start to feel that feeling of panic or insecurity well up inside of you, do something about it. Use practical tools to help change your focus in that moment so that you don't look like this, so that you're not restrained, so that those fears do not have a chance to slowly just wrap themselves tighter and tighter and tighter around you. Put on praise and worship music. Open up God's word and just start to read. Go to him in prayer. Get on your knees and cry out to him and just ask him for help. I'm feeling afraid right now, God. I confess my fear to you right now, God. This is what I'm afraid of. Help me. Take this from me. He promises to do that. Change your focus. Make an actual effort to do something to change your focus. The next one is you have to choose your position. This is the position of fear. You are restrained, you are bound up, and you are stuck. But if you choose to not accept this and you choose to let this image for just a second get seared into your heart and your mind, when you start to feel that fear, you can just close your eyes for a second and go, I do not want to look like Christy, tied up, sitting on the edge of my calling. I want to look like a woman of intention and purpose who is free and able to walk in that calling and move forward and do the things that God asks me to do. I choose to not sit in my life in a position of fear. I choose instead to walk in a position of purpose. And by doing that, by changing your focus and your perspective and choosing your position, you are able to cut the restraints. You're able to free yourself from what that fear looks like. You are able to give God the ability to free up your hands and your feet so that you're not just stuck sitting here, but you can actually get up, get moving, and get out there, ladies, and live that call that he has put on your life that you've been talking about in your chapters and wrestling with in your quiet time and asking for clarity on in your prayer time with God. If you don't know that yet, continue to seek him in it, but do not let your fears of failing, of lack of security, of rejection, of losing control, or of people's judgment, do not let those restrain you anymore. You need free hands and free feet so that you can go forward. And you know what? Sometimes we go forward afraid. Sometimes being afraid is about acknowledging, yep, I'm afraid of that. But you know what? Just because I'm afraid of it doesn't mean it's going to stop me. You know, in my life, one of my biggest fears is a fear of heights. I have a horrible fear of heights. Just the thought of it makes me nauseous. But you know what? If there was a woman and she was sitting at the top of a huge, tall water tower or a building, and she needed somebody to reach out to her, and there was no other option, or she wanted to talk to me, would I like having to climb to those heights? No, absolutely not. But would I do it? In a heartbeat. That's the difference between acknowledging a fear and focusing on a fear. If I was to focus on that, I would stay on the ground. I would say, I'm sorry. I don't have control over what happens up that high. I'm afraid that I might fail and fall. I can't help her. I'm sorry. I just can't, and I won't. And that's binding my hands and my feet again. But instead, I acknowledge, yep, that's really high, and I'm very afraid of that. But I'm going to go forward afraid. Because when I go forward afraid, that, in its own unique way, ladies, is a form of worship. because that is saying to God, I acknowledge that there's a fear, but you know what? I'm not going to give that fear power. And I am not going to allow that fear to rob you of the power that you rightly deserve in my life. And so I'm going to choose to go forward afraid and know that you, God, are bigger than that fear. And in doing so, I am worshiping you by saying, I trust you, I have faith in you, and I'm moving forward with you no matter how scary it feels, because I know that you're going to give me the strength and the energy, the confidence and the ability to do that which you're asking me to do. That's what this is all about. We face our fears by making that choice to change your perspective, to choose your position, and to release yourself from the restraints that you've allowed yourself to become entwined in for far too long, ladies. Your challenge this month, it's pretty simple. This is what I want you to do. As this teaching video ends right now, I want you to spend some time at your tables and in your chapters being really honest with one another. Which of those 5 fears do you struggle with the most? Is it 1 or 2, 3, maybe all of them? Talk about those. What do they look like? How have they manifested themselves in your life? And how does your thought about that fear change in relevance to this discussion tonight about idols and worshiping that fear and not serving 2 masters? I want you to think about that, talk about that in your groups, pray about that in your groups. But then as you leave your LeadHer local meeting and you go out into real life where you have to learn how to apply this out there in a world that's full of fearful things, I want you to talk about how you can use these 3 steps of choosing to change your focus. What are you going to use? Praise worship? All right, create a playlist that maybe this is when I get afraid. These are the 10 songs that I'm going to sit down and put on. Maybe it's going and putting some great power verses on index cards that you keep with you at all times. Maybe it's just making that habit that as soon as you get afraid, you feel that fear, you're just going to start to hit your knees in prayer. Choose to figure out what that is and how to apply those steps to your life this month. Wrestle with that. Commit to making some changes, because we have to actually make some changes to change long-standing habits in being restrained by fear because we formed excuses. Ladies, I know this month isn't going to be an easy one, but I also know that this month might be one of the most freeing months that you have experienced. And I truly believe, I hope and I pray that God is going to work with you and in you to free you from some of these fears, to free you from the bondage that they've held you in, so that He can work in a dramatically new way through you this month and for many months to come. We'll see you guys back in April.